Ghost of the Silent Hill, Chapter 2, March 1956. Pa received the appointment letter to join the Agriculture Institute at Wildflower Hall as its principal. It was an isolated building about 15 kilometers beyond Shimmer. My family had lived in many remote places, so this transfer was accepted without any concern. Apart from a few towns and scattered villages, the rest of Himmicle was anyhow endless lonely stretches of high rugged mountains and arcane valleys enclosed by a lush thick pine and cedar forest, wrapped by tranquil silence, barring sporadic sounds of nature. It was a divine place to live. This majestic structure stood on the ridge of a mountain range at 8,250 feet above the sea level, with no sign of any other human habitation for miles around it. There were no distractions for the residents, no shops, no noisy bazaars, not even a roadside dog or tea shop within the radius of 5 kilometers. The building has withstood the travails of time, though the initial structure has been lost to a fire and the calm to a busy market at its foot. But once the uphill road towards Wildflower Hall initiates, one gets to experience some measure of the original solitude. When Pa joined it, the institute was in its rudimentary stage with about 15 male students enrolled for the course. The workforce comprised of 5 faculty members, 3 clerical, and some general staff. Not to miss one night guard, Pa was the only person residing there with his family, as most others were bachelors. My family lived in the east wing of the ground floor. Rest of the ground floor housed offices and laboratories. The first floor had lecture rooms, and the top floor was allocated for students and the faculty's boarding. Rest of the staff lived in the row of quarters on the west side, behind the main building. I was too small to have understood the bizarre experiences my family underwent there. But so often have these incidents been narrated at the family get-togethers that I feel I have been a direct participant. It began with Pa's younger brother Narendra, Nandi for short, about 25 then, tall, handsome, and reckless. After a bachelor's degree in engineering, he had recently joined the State Public Works Department, had been posted for the past few months at Joyeri, about 150 kilometers beyond Shimmer, bordering the district of Kinnair. My family shifted to Wildflower Hall a few months after Nandi had left for Joyeri towards the end of May. Having gotten an overdose of loneliness, Nandi called up Pa to apprise him of his plan of visiting us a week later. He had checked on the location and the directions to reach our residence, taking the last bus on Friday that left Joyeri at about 6 in the evening and reach us around 10:30. He happily informed, No, take an early bus, Nandi. It will be too late to start. Pa protested. He knew how absurdly foolhardy his younger brother was. Boyji, I need to attend to some urgent meeting that Friday noon and cannot leave before that. I will be with you latest by 11. That is not too late unless you sleep very early, Pa insisted. Don't be silly, Nandi. Night journey is not safe on that route. Know the road. It's too narrow and dangerous. I insist that you start latest by the afternoon on Friday, or take an early bus on Saturday," Nandi complained. "But my leave begins on Saturday, and I don't want to waste a day traveling." "Nandi, safety comes before anything else. Leave early on Saturday, then." "Paul shall try." Then, realizing his brother's concern, Nandi tried resting it. "You don't have to worry about me. I won't be taking any risk. Just a normal bus ride. And you know our Himokul drivers who drive on this route. They are the best." Before his brother could say more, the 2-minute trunk call, only means of electronic communication those days, was over. Knowing Nandi well, Pa knew that he would catch the late evening bus on Friday or none. The road was accident-prone. It wasn't worth taking risks. Moreover, it would not be easy to locate the isolated building at night, which sat in the middle of nowhere. Also, an uphill climb of more than a kilometer would have to be covered on foot, and there was no roadside lighting yet. After putting down the receiver and shaking his head in worry and irritation, Pa voiced his apprehension to Ma. "Nandi knows I will remain worried till he reaches here on time, but he just won't listen." Friday, as he had expected, was a hectic one for Nandi. He wanted to finish all the assignments so that he could spend a peaceful holiday with his brother and his family. Reaching late, in the middle of the night, or being alone in a secluded place were the matters that bothered him the least. At 6, he sent a peon to the bus stop to request the driver to wait for him. He then hurried home to pick up his stuff and rushed to catch the last bus to Shimla. Once inside the bus, he settled down on his reserve seat behind the driver. Beam Singh, the bus conductor with a large curved-up mustache that made him look more like a warrior than a bus conductor, approached him to check if he was comfortable. Nandi was, after all, a special passenger, an educated Sahib. "The bus will reach Shimla at about 11:30. Sahib, we are late today," he responded to Nandini's query with a large gratifying grin, withstanding that Nandi was the cause for the delay. Nandi read his grin with a sheepish smile and simultaneously calculated that he would reach his destination latest by 11. Stretching his legs on the aisle, he surveyed his co-passengers. There were only 8 more travelers, traders or farmers. They were all locals, apparent from their outfit: Churida pajamas, Curtis, high-collared rough woolen jackets, and Busheri caps adorned with monal pheasant's feathers. Acknowledged Nandi's presence with polite smiles and namaste, and Nandi returned their greetings. Before boarding the bus, he had noted a few large sacks stuffed with local produce, chiefly potatoes, on the rooftop carrier. Crop fetched a better price at Shimla market. A few were perhaps going to purchase supplies from Shimla for their business establishments here. Completing the scrutiny, Nandi settled down to read Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, the book that had fetched the author the Nobel Prize in Literature 2 years ago. The rickety bus plying on the narrow bumpy road kept him alert and his attention divided between the book and the road. It was certainly not an easy drive. He and his co-passengers were entirely at the mercy of the driver's proficiency. The scenic beauty around was stunning, not worth missing even for the engrossing book. The almost straight walls of the high mountains stood on one side, and deep cliffs dropped down hundreds of feet into the narrow gorge on the other, where gushed the river settled through its rapids, cascading and roaring. Sometimes the river ran almost next to the road, through a broad valley, calm and serene, adding spurting music to the rattle of the bus. Then it began to drift away, its serpentine course once again plunging deep into ravine. There, in the fading light, it looked like a silver band waving in a breeze. At places, if Nandi peeped out of the window, it gave him a fright, as there seemed hardly any road between the wheel of the bus and the sudden drop from the precipice. He focused his attention on the tall, stately conifers that covered the hillsides. The undergrowth here rendered the hills lush green. A few curves later, the vegetation was suddenly gone as if by a magic spell, and the mountain became bare and rocky. The rocks were a spectacle of colors: light gray, slate gray, green, blazing copper. Huge rocks jutted out of the mountain wall, ready to roll down. There was occasional rain of small rocks. This part was known to be very unstable, and the drivers had to be at full alert in case a big boulder began rolling down all of a sudden. Nandi sat stiff at the edge of the seat, sending quick silent prayers. He was well versed with the geology of the region, which now, in the fading twilight, seemed even more daunting. Soon, nightfall began to engulf the landscape. Eventually, only a small portion of the dark road gleamed in the headlights of the bus. The day's tiredness began to overtake Nandi, and he dozed off into a dreamless sleep. Skritik. Nandi was roughly jolted out of his sleep. His head hit the glass partition of the driver's cabin with a bang. His eyes flew open. He found his heart racing and head spinning. After a few seconds, he managed to sit upright in his seat. He breathed deeply, rubbing his head. Why had the bus come to a stop so roughly? The driver was sitting frozen on his seat. He then turned and gave Nandi a pale, apologetic smile. He was visibly shaken. Nandi watched him join his hands and mumble prayers to the little idol of Lord Hanuman kept at the center of the dashboard. It was absolutely dark outside. Nandi shadowed his eyes with his palms to peep out of the window. There was no visible light indicating human habitation. Electricity hadn't reached the remote villages yet. People used kerosene lamps, but on the mountains even the faint light was visible from far. Nandi spotted none. He checked the time by his watch. It was 15 minutes to 8. He had barely slept for about 20 minutes. He got up to check with the driver why he had decided to stop the bus in this wilderness with such an incredible jolt. The driver and the conductor were hurriedly jumping off the bus. Nandi followed suit. He found the conductor sitting on his haunches, aiming light from a torch at the bus belly, and the driver half under the bus. Why wasn't he inspecting the engine? Nandi frowned. The driver then straightened up and shook his head. Nadi's heart skipped a beat, noting the disappointment on his face. All should be well with the bus. He had no intentions of spending the night out here, in these forsaken surroundings. By and by the other passengers got down from the bus, rubbing their heads or shoulders. Nandi stroked his head where a big painful lump had begun to form. "Sorry, Sahib," with his hands joined in an apology. The driver, Ram Prasad, directly addressed Nandi, confirming his worst fears. "We are in deep soup. The front axle has broken." Nandi shook his head in frustration. "Oh hell, how? What happened?" "Sahib, I hit that big boulder. I saw it only at the last minute." He pointed towards the direction they had just covered, and Bhim Singh aimed the torchlight there. "As I negotiated this blind curve, there it lay in the middle of the road. Doesn't it seem that someone has planted it here, deliberately, with the intention to create trouble?" Frowns deepened on many foreheads, and before I could apply brakes, the axle hit it and broke. With his arms limply hanging on the sides, Ram Prasad stood resigned and helpless, looking from one person to another, seeking their support. All eyes worryingly scrutinized the blind curve and then the large boulder. No one uttered a single word. Bhim Singh came to his partner's aid. Sahib, Ram Prasad had the presence of mind to immediately steer the bus towards the mountainside before coming to a halt. If he had lost control, the bus would have rolled down the deep gorge. He folded his hands to thank the one who had saved them from such a fate. "Haram, Haram," he chanted a number of times. The passengers looked at each other. Perhaps someone would come up with a rescue plan. All eyes finally came to rest on Nandi. He was an engineer with the Public Works Department, and hence important for those who use these underdeveloped roads on a daily basis. He was in authority to lessen their woes. Nandi knew well that at this particular stretch the hillside was very weak. Frequently, big boulders rolled down and crashed on the road. The huge ones even tore down the road, and dashing down the gorge they plunged into the river with such a deafening explosion that it shook the earth. People could hear it even 50 miles away. He had surveyed quite a few such road damages in the past few months of his job. But without his workforce, presently, he was as helpless as any one of them. So, he simply shrugged his shoulders. Ram Prasad rubbed his stubble in frustration. "This area is a menace for the drivers. A number of times I have removed such huge blockages from the road with the help of the passengers. There have also been instances of vehicles getting directly hit by the rolling boulders." He looked at his passengers gathered around him. "Perhaps you know about the accident that took place just 2 months ago. A huge boulder crushed a jeep. All 6 passengers died on the spot." He shook his bowed head sadly and simultaneously pointed at his bus. "This is a minor irritant." Nandi stood still. He knew about the accident. The jeep belonged to his department. A senior officer was visiting from the head office for inspection. He too was to travel in the jeep that day. but had been taken ill with an intestinal infection. His junior had volunteered to go instead. It was a sad and unnerving accident, but he was thankful to God for his providential escape. As of now, they were in serious trouble. He regretted not paying heed to his brother's advice. Had he caught an earlier bus, he wouldn't be stranded in this isolated place, in this dark night. It must have been a minor problem for the bus crew, for they were used to such adversities and were mentally prepared. For him, this was a huge cause for distress. The thought of spending the whole night in these lonely jungles was worrisome. On top of this, his brother would be extremely anxious if he didn't reach on time. There was no way he could inform him now. The night was getting colder. He shivered despite the woolen pullover he was wearing. He rubbed his hands to warm them and then folded his arms to cover his chest. Ram Prasad, we need to remove the boulder from the road before some other vehicle hits it. There was an immediate reaction. All rushed to follow his advice. In the torchlight facilitated by Bhim Singh, they pushed the boulder down the ravine. It was only after a minute that they heard a booming splash from the dark depths. Nandi borrowed Bhim Singh's torch and left the group gathered around the bus gazing at it, as if they were observing an antique relic in a museum. Walked across the road and peered in the dark as far as he could. Beyond the 4 meters broad road he faced a huge black chasm. The mountain receded out of his vision, plunging into abrupt darkness, and then rose again into another colossal, formidable, dark range on the far side. No lights, not even headlights of any vehicle were visible anywhere. The moon was yet to rise to relieve them of the near total darkness that engulfed them. He regarded the towering Himalayan mountains, generally imposing, serene, and dignified, appeared a terrifying army of hulks that had surrounded the poor hapless bus passengers and wanted to swallow them. The usually elegant cedar, fir, and kir pine trees seemed like uncountable black daunting trolls closing in on them. The surge of the river Sutlej reverberated thunderously in the entire surroundings like an outlandish battle cry. It all sent his heart pounding, shivered and cursed his luck. Only today the bus had to break down. He shook his head and turned to regard the bus. It was stuck immobile, wedged against the mountain. A useless piece of metal now. The eerie silence was thankfully being broken by human voices, and Nandi was suddenly grateful for the company. He rushed back to join the rest, who were busy imparting their impractical opinions. Nandi once again counted and confirmed the presence of 11 men, now stranded in the middle of nowhere. He must think of some way out of this predicament. He weighed all the possibilities in his mind and then asked Ram Prasad, "Is there a village nearby? We can walk to it to spend the night there." Ram Prasad shook his head vigorously. "No, Sahib, there isn't any habitation for miles around us. Only about 8 miles ahead. There's a small village of 6-7 houses. But to reach that village on foot, it'll mean a walk of at least 2 hours, maybe more in this dark." He shrugged his shoulders and continued, "Anyway, Bhim and I can't leave the vehicle. We'll have to sleep inside till help arrives. Nandi shook his head dejectedly. What help? Sahib. The bus that'll pass by in the morning will report our plight to the head office and they will send a tow vehicle. We'll have to sleep inside till help arrives. Nandi shook his head dejectedly. What help? Sahib. The bus that'll pass by in the morning will report our plight to the head office and they will send a tow vehicle. Till then nothing can be done. After a disheartened silence, Nandi asked disconsolately, Nothing till tomorrow morning. You have some chance of getting a lift if you wait here, next to our broken down bus. But not anywhere else on the road. A passing vehicle will possibly stop to check if we need help. But no driver will stop in the middle of the night anywhere in this wilderness to give lift to strangers out of the blue. Bhim Singh instantly supported his colleague. Ram Prasad is right. This is the only solution. Stay here and wait, or they'll expect only an occasional army truck or a convoy at this time. But that doesn't happen every day. Nandi sighed and added, Okay, if any vehicle passes by, be ready to stop it. We could hitch a ride to our destination, or at least till Narkonda, and escape from the possibility of spending the night in this forsaken jungle. He threw a glance at the broken-down bus resting against the mountain wall. There was barely enough space for another vehicle to pass by. Even a minor deviation could send the vehicle plunging down. Shivram, a fellow passenger who ran a small convenience store, spoke in a small voice, as if his statement might come true if he uttered it loudly. What if no vehicle comes tonight? Ram Prasad raised his hands in a gesture of utter helplessness. Resigned to the fate and be prepared to spend the night in the bus. But I tell you, I am much relieved that I have you all with me tonight. That makes me very comfortable. A few months ago, during the peak winter season, our bus had got stranded one night due to a large landslide, and except for the two of us, there was no one in the bus. Both of us had spent the entire night alone in these wilds, wide awake and singing bhajans and shivering in cold. It was a terrible night. Won't forget it for the rest of my life. Bhim Singh clicked his tongue. We even heard strange sounds. Something was there outside the bus, walking around. We shuddered in fright. Animals. Himalayan bears. Nandi's query was ignored on purpose. Covered up the science. If we do not get any help tonight, you'll be again sleeping in the bus, and we'll be singing bhajans with you, he chortled, which seemed incongruent. Sahib, praying and singing holy songs is a good idea. Otherwise, who can sleep in these isolated forests, especially in the dark? The animals are not the only ones who pose the risk. Prasad gazed at Nandi, worried. Why? Are there robbers or dacoits in this area? Nandi knew it was a silly question. Existence of dacoits in the remote area of Himachal was a suggestion akin to expecting blue whales jumping out of the river Sutlej. Crime among these simple, honest, hard-working Paris was almost unheard of. Nandi noted a quick exchange of glances. Then Shivram remarked, "Educated sahibs do not believe in all these things. Better not begin discussing such matters now. And adhere to our plight. We aren't sitting gossiping around a fire inside our protected homes. What matters?" Nandini's curiosity had been provoked. Bhim Singh replied in a hushed tone, "Sahib, we simple villagers have grown up with all kinds of beliefs in ghosts and chudals, the wandering spirits. The main reason for our anxiety is the accident about a year ago, somewhere around this area. It could have been the exact spot. Who knows? It's difficult to know in this dark. But this is not the right time to discuss it, neither the right place," voiced Shivram stridently. Nandi was rather amused, and he laughed. "Don't worry. I am not afraid of ghosts, for I really don't believe in them. Never met one. Go ahead. Tell me about the accident." He halted and frowned. "Wait a minute. I think I heard about a terrible mishap that had occurred last year during the monsoons before I came to Johari. Are you talking about the bus full of passengers that fell down the deep gorge into the river?" A creepy silence embraced them all. The hushing waters of the Satel became more defined and menacing. Without adding a word, the passengers quickly began to board the bus, as if seeking shelter against some invisible danger. With dwindling spirit, Nandi watched them all disappear inside the bus. When Ram Prasid and Bhim Singh chose to go back into the bus, Nandi threw a quick glance around and then followed them. He noticed that the passengers were no longer sitting on their original seats. When they had begun the journey, each had laid claim to a double seat. But now they were all huddled together on a few front seats. Even the driver and the conductor had chosen to sit among them. Only his original seat behind the driver's lay vacant. Once Nandi was inside the bus, Bhim Singh hurriedly got up and shut the door. He bolted it and then checked it by giving it a hard shove. Satisfied, he returned to his seat. With other passengers crowding around him, Nandi raised the topic of the fateful accident again. "Ram Prasid, you must have known the unfortunate driver of that bus." "Yes, Sahib. We both had joined the service about the same time. He was young, almost my age, not even 40. He left behind little children, the youngest not even a year old. It was a terrible accident, Sahib. Not a single survivor." Ram Prasid shook his head despairingly. "You see, Sahib, this stretch of about 5 kilometers has a whole lot of loose rocks." A weak smile appeared on his face. "Of course, who would know that better than yourself, True. I have inspected the road thoroughly. These big boulders are real nuisance. Come rolling down anytime, without warning. It gets worse during the rains. Nothing can be done, unless we build huge retaining walls that will need a lot of money." "Yes, Sahib." It was one of those exceptionally huge boulders that had become loose and came hurtling down. According to the eyewitnesses, the bus was tossed like a toy by that speeding boulder, and then both went tumbling down into the Satel. It was a terrible accident. The bus was washed down for another half a mile before a big rock in the middle of the river finally halted its flow. There was no chance for any survival. The river was in full spate. Listeners shook their heads sadly. A few joined their hands and chanted Ram, Ram, Jai Bolnath, Jai Ma Bhavani. Ram Prasad closed his eyes for a quick prayer before speaking barely above a whisper, eyeing the dark exteriors through the window. And Sahib, since then people have heard spirits crying in this area at night. I think Beam and I heard them that night. The night we were stranded. Due to the fears of, you may say, foolish people like us. 2 months ago, a similar accident took place at almost the same site. That government jeep, you know, with its 6 occupants, crushed by a big boulder. All Sahibs killed, and the driver too. Really? The same spot. Nadi's brow was furrowed. Yes, Sahib. And people said it was due to the vengeful spirits of those dead. Even the temple priest of our village agreed. So the drivers are wary of this section. I was, as usual, driving so cautiously, with prayers in my heart. Wonder how I missed the wretched rock. I really wonder. Nandi had never believed in ghosts and spirits. He might have liked listening to ghost stories in his childhood, but later his mature mind perceived them as fabulous imagination of some overtly irrational minds. But at present, the stark wilderness, the dark, cold night, haunting sound of the gushing river rising from the deep gorge, and the thought of some wandering spirits of the people who had had a natural death in the area, it all sent shivers down his spine. Nevertheless, putting up a brave front, he rubbished the cause for fear. I know such accidents are sad, especially for those who lose their relatives, the spirits of the dead wandering. I really don't believe that. He persuasively shook his head. I told you Sahib wouldn't believe. Shivram informed others as if he had unearthed a great scientific secret. It is we simple people who fear the wandering souls of the dead. He got up from his seat and came to sit next to Nandi. Sahib, we believe that when someone dies in a natural death, spirit does not achieve its salvation till it has completed the unfulfilled tasks of its life. For example, spirits of young virgin maids roam in search of mates, living mates for the dead. How's that possible? Nandi scoffed. It's true, Sahib. There was a time I too wouldn't have believed such tales. It was Desai speaking. Sitting cross-legged on his seat, he had been quietly listening to the discussion till now. Well into his 50s. He ran a grocery shop in Johari. It was when my young son was troubled by such a spirit that I realized they actually exist. Shivram nodded in support. Oh, really? Tell me about it. Nandi tried smiling cynically, yet appeared more like a curious child. Desai looked around, seeking approval. A few men squirmed on their seats in anticipation. Some threw quick glances at the dark windows in apprehension. No protests were raised, for who could deny oneself of the romance with fear? The ambience couldn't have been better. Desai folded his arms and cleared his throat. Others snuggled closer. Nandi stretched his legs in the aisle with careless defiance. It happened last summer. Desi looked at Nandi and, finding him attentive, nodded approvingly. Late one evening, my son, Retin, was returning from a nearby village after spending the afternoon with his friend. It was well after sunset. Darkness was slowly creeping in. He was striding homeward, merrily singing. He has always been masked, a happy-go-lucky fellow, you know, and a good singer, too. He was still a mile away from home when on that lonely stretch he stopped dead in his tracks, noticing a beautiful young girl sitting on a rock beside the footpath. My Retin, barely 17, was enamored by her beauty and stood gaping at her. She returned his stare with a luring smile. He stared at her stupefied. Silly boy. Even though he had never seen her before, he smiled at her and then, at last realizing that it wasn't proper to stare at a stranger thus, he walked on. The girl began following him. Retin must have been thrilled at the attention. Nandi threw up his head and laughed. Sahib, that's exactly the mistake he committed. Well known that a well-raised, decent girl would never do that. Do what? She didn't do anything. Nandi raised his eyebrows, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. Desi frowned disapprovingly. In the first place, she shouldn't have been out alone in a secluded place at that late hour, and then stare at an unknown young male. No. Our girls are taught modesty. He looked around at the others who nodded, supporting his statement. My young boy's mind couldn't grasp that fact. Perhaps he wasn't thinking at all. He thought he was a dandy, on whom the beautiful young girl was granting her attention. He was delighted by her interest in him, naturally. Nandi grinned. There were a few coughs, and some light laughter that peeved Desi. Sahib, first listen to the whole affair, okay? Go ahead. I won't interrupt. Nandi raised his hands impatiently. Desi took a deep breath and continued. The girl continued to follow him. My boy, overjoyed by the attention, kept on turning, time and again, to look at her. She followed him around 3 or 4 curves, and then all of a sudden she disappeared. One moment she was behind him. Next moment there was nobody. Desi stopped to check the impact of his account on the listeners. A nocturnal animal howled from somewhere close. All eyes brusquely shifted towards the door. The heartbeats increased. Desi broke the silence. Retin looked around, even went back a few curves, searching to see where she had vanished. He didn't find anyone. Not a soul. Finally, his 2 bullets switched on. He was frightened, realizing he had probably seen a ghost, and hurried home. He didn't share this incident with anyone at home. A few men briefly glanced at the windows as if they expected someone there, furtively eavesdropping. The darkness outside had deepened. Nandi waved his hand slapstickly and broke the silence. She must have been a young girl from a nearby village in love with your son. Might have hidden in a bush or... No, Sahib, Have patience. I haven't finished yet. Daresay spoke fervidly. A night or two later, after dinner, Ratton was in his room, engrossed in his studies, preparing for his matric exams. He felt a sudden cold around him, like being back in icy winters. He looked up from his book, and there she was, standing in front of him. He looked at the window, thinking she had sneaked in through it. But it was shut. The door was shut too. How did he enter? As he stifled his scream, the girl stretched her arms, inviting him. No village girl would behave in this manner. They are shy. Even my silly Ratton knew that. Daresay paused and threw a discreet glance at Nandy. Nandy avoided him and turned to look out. Darkness and solitude stared back at him. A mild fear crept into him. My boy was scared. Daresay brought him back to the narration, frightened out of his wits. How had she entered his room when the window and the door were bolted from inside? Who was she? At that moment, he was sure that she wasn't a human. Before he could shout for help, she faded in front of his eyes, mist evaporating in heat. My silly boy still remained tight-lipped. He should have at least let me know. Daresay let out a long sigh of despair. Then it became her ritual to visit Ratton every night. She wouldn't utter a word, but only extend her arms, inviting him. Ratton would shrink into a ball and tremble. In the beginning she would not appear for more than a few minutes. She then began visiting him in his dreams too, touching him, hugging him. Were those dreams, or was she there in reality when my son was half conscious, in a trance? I can't say. No member in the house ever saw, heard her coming. So you had no clue about what was happening to your son? Asked Nandy. No. Say Herb. Not a clue. I did notice that Ratton wasn't eating well, was getting thinner and unhealthy. He appeared listless, and I got worried he had gotten ill. I took him to the village Hakim. He went reluctantly. It was only after the Hakim questioned him repeatedly that he broke down and told us about her. By then the spirit had become persistent. He told us that when in the middle of the previous night he had woken up, he had found her in his bed, lying next to him. He could see her, but when he daringly extended his hand, he felt he had put his hand inside an icy mist. Ram. That must have been frightening. Ram Prasad shook visibly. Daresay nodded. Initially, we couldn't believe she existed and thought it was a juvenile mind's fantasy. Ratton continued to lose weight. From a healthy pudgy boy he became a bag of bones, became dark like charcoal. The change was alarming. He began roving around meaninglessly, stopped talking, stopped studying, had to be force-fed. His exams were approaching, and I didn't know what to do. I made sure he was never alone, that somebody was constantly with him. But that didn't deter her. She began to visit many times in a day, so you also began to see her. No, none of us saw her, but my son would become pale and begin to tremble. He would gaze in one direction, where she would be standing, thought he was losing his mind, becoming crazy. We all were at a loss how to help him. The Hakim didn't have any cure either. Then we went to the temple priest. He listened to us, discussed things with my son alone, and then decided to arrange for exorcists. So the priest knew it was a ghost troubling him, Nandi asked. Yes, then they came, dressed in black. For exorcists, they looked daunting with their long, open, unkempt matted hair falling till their waists and their faces painted white and red. They carried brass tridents and some other stuff, made a big bonfire, and seated my son next to it, raising their tridents high, the weapon of Lord Shiva. They began moving in circles around the fire, chanting incessantly. Their steps kept on becoming faster, and their chanting louder and intense. Every few seconds, they threw things in the fire, things that would drive away the spirit. I understood. The incantation continued for almost half an hour without any obvious effect. We began to get bored with the rituals. I thought it was all hocus pocus. They were taking advantage of the situation and were to cheat me. They had already taken a hefty amount from me before starting. So, I was getting angry and was about to ask them to stop the fuss and leave. And you wouldn't believe. Sahib, a woman's screams burst forth all of a sudden from where Ratan was seated. Even those who wouldn't believe us before, and considered my son mad, heard those dreadful cries of an unseen being and became pale. Many began to tremble with fear. Then one of the exorcists began conversing with the unseen entity. We could hear some snuffling sounds for a while before all became quiet. I instantly noted some color return to my son's face. We were then informed that the spirit had been evicted, sent to her realm, and it was a good riddance. Exorcists told us that it was a spirit of a young unmarried girl who had died an unnatural death, but was unaware that she was dead, and she claimed to be in love with my Ratan. Did you find out if it were true? Nandi asked. And whose spirit it was? Yes. We unearthed that a few months ago a young girl from our neighboring village had slipped off a cliff, hit her head on a rock, and died. And she was apparently a very beautiful girl. We concluded that it was her spirit, restless and wandering. Oh, did it make any difference? I mean the exorcism, of course. Things became normal. She never appeared to Ratan again. He's a happy, normal chap now. Azunda College at Shimmer. In fact, that's where I'm heading, to meet him. May God look after my boy. He's a good chap. Folded his hands and bowed to the god Hanuman's idol on the dashboard. So, you see, Sahib, some spirits do wander our realm. The ones that had unnatural deaths and therefore haven't attained peace. That's what we believe. No one spoke for a while. The sound of heavy breathing filled the bus. Even Nandi was edgy. Desai appeared a simple man, and not someone who would tell lies with the purpose of frightening others, Nandi concluded with unease. Desai then looked defiantly at Nandi and said, "This was my personal experience, Sahib. not something I had heard from others. How can we not believe in the existence of the supernatural? That is true. Many people undergo strange experiences with good or evil spirits. Ram Prasad nodded and then joined hands. But right now, more we discuss this topic, more fearful we'll get. Please, let's discuss something less frightening. Pray to the Almighty for our safety. Bhim Singh advised and then began to sing the Hanuman Chalisa. Others immediately joined him. Nandi didn't know the complete prayer but kept lisping along. The next half an hour was spent singing series of holy songs that brought them some respite from fear of the unknown. With it came the realization that they had completely forgotten about their need for food. It was much past dinner time. Nandi had planned to grab a bite at Narkonda. It was his good fortune that there was enough food with his co-passengers and he didn't have to go hungry. Singing of bhajans continued after dinner, a persistent effort to keep fear at bay. Nandi had kept his hearing faculties alert for the sounds overriding interior din. To his dismay, not a single vehicle had come their way in the past 2 hours. Around 10, Bhim Singh checked all the windows and the door once again. He then made the declaration that it was time to sleep. Prayers in your mind, he appealed before switching off the light. The sudden darkness was disconcerting. Outside, the landscape was washed in a faint silver light as the moon had made its appearance above a tall peak. Nandi stretched on his seat, but only half of his torso fitted on it. The rest of his lanky body hanged at various angles before his feet came to rest on the floor. It was the most uncomfortable sleep posture. The silence and the creaking seats, both were disturbing. He closed his eyes but knew sleep was a remote possibility tonight. And again he kept raising his neck to peep out in hope of spotting some artificial light. But each time he confronted stark desolation. He had always considered himself a fearless man. But each passing minute tightened the knots in his stomach a bit more. Minutes crept into an hour. He needed to relieve his bladder. Where was his courage? He was afraid to step out alone. The nocturnal predators like leopards and bears that abounded the area were not the ones that made him nervous tonight. Was it a good idea to have allowed Desi tell his frightening story at Wildflower Hall? Or was a bundle of nerves? It was past 11:30. There was no sign of Nandi. There was no way to check on him now. Deadly amalgamation of his anxiety and anger were reaching the peak. Typical of Nandi, this careless attitude. He has probably missed the bus, but wouldn't think of informing. But tried resting his anxiety. He had booked a trunk call but it hadn't come through either. There was no answer from the other side, he was told. Alarming thoughts were invading his mind one after the other. He was nervous but ordered all to retire for the night. Unable to sleep, he just sat on a chair in the drawing room, brooding, his forehead wrinkled in a deep frown. He knew the geology of the region well. Knew of frequent landslides and sudden falling boulders. The road itself was not in good condition. all should be well with Nandi. He prayed. After a long wait, finally he went to his bedroom for a restless night. However much Nandi tried to sleep, he just couldn't. The incident that had taken place around this area kept hovering in his mind like an obstinate fly. Raised his head to glance around, except for Daisy. All had tightly wrapped their blankets around and were restlessly shifting inside their makeshift cocoons. The driver, the conductor sat in the front cabin, chatting softly. Daisy sat cross-legged on his seat with eyes closed and was mumbling continually. Nandi was gratified that someone was trying to keep them safe. Through his ardent prayers,